for joining us today for our No Stupid podcast. I'm Dr. Kim Bissell, the Southern Progress Endowed Professor in Magazine Journalism and the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Communication and Information Sciences, or CNIS, at the University of Alabama.
And I'm Dr. Annalisa Bowen, an Assistant Professor in the Department of Communication Studies, also at the University of Alabama. And we both work in the Institute for Communication and Information Research, or the ICIR, at UA. So Kim, I have to ask you, do you have your voting plan ready?
Yes, I have a voting plan. I have a backup plan in case there's a big long line, and another backup plan in case there's a medium-sized line. But here's another question. What do we do if we're in a long line, distance appropriately, while we're waiting? Should we try to talk to people who are nearest in line? Is that a good idea? Everyone says to never talk about politics, but should we stay away from the topic of politics while we're standing in line to vote?
I mean, I think that's maybe. I think that's a great question. And our guest today is Dr. Cynthia Peacock, an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies. And she studies many things related to political communication, including engagement in the democratic process and civil discourse. She also studies phenomena like news deserts, a concept that's similar to food deserts. How can we access good news and politics? Where can we access good news and about politics? And with the holidays coming up, how can we have good and pleasant conversations with people we might not politically agree with? Or should we just avoid these conversations at all costs? We'll learn more about this in today's conversation. So welcome, Dr. Cynthia Peacock.
And welcome, Cynthia.
Welcome,
Thank
Cynthia.
you. Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here.
So first things, can you give us an elevator pitch on your research?
Yeah, I study how people form, change, and express their political opinions. And that work falls into two primary areas. One is media use. So where do they get their news and how do they engage with it? And the other side is interpersonal communication. So the sort of political discussions and disagreements that they have.
I like how you said disagreements. Does anyone ever agree?
Yeah, it's funny, actually. We're known to have conversations with people with whom we agree and avoid conversations with people we disagree with. And that's where a lot of my work falls.
I mean, that's so fascinating. And I feel like you could come up with a pretty easy headline for one of your most interesting findings. So we're going to ask you to do that. Can you give us a headline for one of your findings?
I can, and this headline sort of encompasses a lot of my findings, which is political talk, good for democracy, bad for relationships.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
So what kind of relationships are you talking about there?
Well, a lot of my work sort of falls under the umbrella of deliberative democracy, which basically says that people need to interact with one another. And not only do we need to talk to one another and interact with one another, we actually have to do that with people with whom we disagree also. So it's really important that people are able to express their political opinions. And I've looked at that in different ways, a lot of interpersonal relationships, and then also in sort of more formal deliberative circumstances.
So Cynthia, our listeners are going to be hearing this right before our 2020 election. And I know back in the spring, before everything kind of shut down with the global pandemic, you had the opportunity to take students to Iowa for the Iowa caucuses. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were doing and what the students were doing, and just talk about your whole experience there?
Yeah, absolutely. I was so fortunate to have a wonderful group of graduate students from across the college And we went to Iowa for a few days leading up to the Iowa caucuses. And our goal was to attend as many political rallies as possible. As people probably know, Iowa gets a lot of attention from the presidential candidates. And so at the time, there were several Democrats still running. And we got to attend lots of political rallies and listen to all of the candidates speak. And we gathered survey data from people who were attending the rallies. And then it was an excellent, exciting experience. And then when we got back, we analyzed the data that we had gathered there and wrote a paper about what people like about the candidates.
I mean, so that's just the coolest thing. So you said that you were collecting survey data. So were you interviewing people face to face? Or how did all that work?
Yes, which was new for me. I do primarily work with quantitative data, and a lot of times that's surveys, and we're so lucky to be able to gather lots of data online from people all over the place. So this was really my first experience, and the first experience for my students gathering survey data on the ground, which is a whole different ballgame. So you have to, actually approach people and say, hi, we're from the University of Alabama. We would love to know what you think. Would you mind filling out this survey? And we did have the forethought to actually have a QR code that they could also scan on their iPhone and take it online.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so that was new, but we were really fortunate, and people were very gracious and good about giving us their time and their thoughts.
So were your students a little bit hesitant to approach people? Had they ever done any kind of research prior to this?
Yeah, most of them had not. And if they'd done research, it certainly didn't involve going right up to your research participants. So some of them were reticent, and I was too. And we talked a lot about that before we went to Iowa, how that was what was involved. But, I told them to take advantage of the fact that they're young, they're students, people are generally pretty willing to help out students. So it was a really great experience. And I'm so glad that they had such a positive experience. We didn't have any problems. People were really gracious.
So how many students did you take up there?
5 students.
So in your experience with kind of training students to collect data and think about just the whole process, did y'all have any conversations within your group that were disagree with politics, or was it just like the research process?
I mean, teaching political communication, particularly in election years, can be tricky, and it's important to me as a scholar and as a teacher for my students, regardless of what their positions are, to feel really comfortable in class. I mean, I may study a particular topic, but we're not necessarily there to discuss the topic itself. Mm-hmm. I study human communication, so I want to know why people think what they do and how they think about something and interact around it. So, inevitably, sometimes people share their positions, which is fine. I mean, a lot of my research is built on the premise that people should be able to express their political opinions. Mm-hmm. But I do my best to make sure that things stay civil and productive, and that we don't get sidetracked in talking about issues and not about the actual research that we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have to imagine that can be a challenge at times, because I feel like keeping silent on political issues especially can be really, really hard. I mean, what did you find with the students? Were they really good about just adhering to, we're going to stick to the research and not have that dialogue?
Yeah, well, I definitely don't want to shut them down. And that was the Iowa trip was a very unique situation. We were together for sometimes up to 12 hours a day because we were traveling to different cities to attend different rallies. Mm. And so, we're in the van and we're traveling around and everyone's talking. So that's much different than in the classroom. But I think either way for me, I never want to shut down a student. I'm quite devoted to having politically engaged students. So I want to encourage that. But it is important to sort of, make sure that the conversations stay productive and that everyone feels comfortable being part of it.
How do you create that sense of being comfortable, especially when it seems like there's often a events maybe that can be quite political or partisan?
Yeah, again, it's tricky. The Iowa group, the graduate students, there were only 5 of them. That was just easier, I think. But in the classroom, my first semester at Alabama was the fall of 2016, and I was teaching campaign and elections class leading up to the 2016 presidential election. And there were definitely some times where, I needed to be thoughtful about how to navigate that within the classroom. I think that, we're not necessarily trained to do that, but when students feel heard, that's really an important part of it. So I just try to hear them out and give them space, but also make space for students who don't feel comfortable speaking out. And I just don't have a problem changing topics when we need to, and letting, keeping sort of a little bit of control inside the classroom.
Yeah.
So, Cynthia, you said earlier that you do quantitative research. So when we're thinking about the methods that you typically use, can you talk us through some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I do primarily do quantitative research, but I also have used qualitative methods like interviews and focus groups in the past. I'm a big believer in letting the method be guided by the question. So there are some questions that I have that make sense. I can find out the answer with a survey. And there are these great benefits from gathering a whole lot of quantitative data. We get the benefit of trying to make some semi-generalizable claims about relationships. But there are some things that we miss, like the details of what people really think. And so sometimes it's better, if my question has to do with people's experiences or their interactions, to have a focus group or interviews and really get the rich data, the detail of what people actually say and think and how they interact. So yeah, I tend towards surveys because a lot of the questions I have can be answered with experiments or surveys. And I am drawn to the, larger data and being able to make some sort of generalizable claims. But I also enjoy doing focus groups and interviews as well.
Do you ever find that people are hesitant to participate given the nature of your research?
Well, I think that's one reason why I really do like surveys so much. We live in a time now where once my survey's ready to go, I can field it and have, a few hundred responses in a day or two. And it's because people are taking these at their convenience, at their homes, on their phones. And so there's a great benefit of them not feeling any social pressure. They don't have to come into a lab. I never see them. I never know who they are. So the anonymity is excellent in doing survey research now. So that helps. There's definitely a difference when you bring people into a room and ask them to discuss a political topic.
I'm sure. Can you tell us how you got started doing this type of research?
Yeah, so I was always interested in politics. My dad was always reading the newspaper and watching the Sunday morning political shows. And I just really was interested in the way people form their political opinions and how they talk about them. So many years later, when I took my first political communication class, it was like immediately I knew that that's exactly what I wanted to be doing. I was so excited to know that you could actually study this thing that I had been so interested in for so long. So that was excellent. And if you have, great teachers and mentors like I did, then they show you how to take your excitement and interest in an area and turn that into research. So that's what I did. And then as for my specific area, my interest in people's political opinion expression, that really came from my own experiences of watching people not say what they thought about a specific issue. And even myself, even if I was knowledgeable and felt strongly about something, still withholding sometimes. And I just thought it was really important. At the time I was reading, all this literature about deliberative democracy and, how we all play a role, and it's so important. And so I really wanted to dig in and understand how that functions as a human communication phenomenon. So I know we need it for democracy, but it's a whole different thing in real life, in everyday life.
Certainly.
Yeah, I think that point is really cool, because you're taking this interest that you have from kind of reading journal articles and reading research to actually applying it out there in the real world, which is it's very cool to see research inform like daily life and what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely, one of my favorite things about what I research is that pretty much everyone can relate to it.
Mm-hmm. So I know when you were in Iowa, you were working with students, but typically, is the research that you do, are you just working independently? Are you working with collaborators?
Yeah, I absolutely love collaborating. It's my preferred way to work. Research can be a lonely space, and I'm pretty social, so I like working with other folks. So one reason is it's just more fun to work with other people. But another reason is I think that collaborating can really up the quality of your scholarship. At least I find that when I'm working with folks who have, a different background, different training, different strengths than mine, the project gets better because we have different perspectives and we can, listen to one another and think deeply about the project. So I love collaborating, and particularly with people whose work complements my own. So we have different strengths, and I really enjoy that.
Well, it sounds like there are opportunities for you to work in an interdisciplinary fashion. Has that been the case?
Yeah, absolutely. Because political communication, is an area that sort of can fall into multiple different disciplines. I've found myself overlapping and working with folks in political science, with folks in journalism, with people in sociology and psychology. So it is a great opportunity to work interdisciplinarily.
So Cynthia, obviously right now we have a election year. What happens kind of in the interim when there's not so much political news or chance for engagement? What are you studying kind of in those more maybe downtime?
Yeah, most of my work isn't really dependent on things like an election or major political events. I really have always been most interested in the citizen side, the individual side of how people form their opinions and the way they express them, and what relationships and media use have to do with that. So as exciting as elections are, I tend to find myself more interested in the everyday practice of politics.
And I think that's a really important point. Like politics and opinions and how we form them, that doesn't just happen once every 4 or 2 years.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it seems like there would be opportunities for some of the work that you do to contribute to social justice. Could you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, my work is not necessarily centered on social justice as a topic, but I think probably the best way that my work sort of works towards justice is thinking about people's ability to express themselves politically and their own engagement. And I'll give this as an example. I mentioned to you my first semester at Alabama was during the 2016 election. And I had a student athlete in class that semester who had posted a very benign actually question on Twitter during one of the presidential debates, and just caught a load of flack from some Twitter users who felt like it wasn't appropriate for him to be, talking about politics. And so the next morning in class, when we met, we talked about that, and it felt really good to have a couple of 100 years of deliberative theory to back me up by telling him that not only is that he can do that, that he should be doing that. And actually, community, society, and democracy depend on our engagement with these issues. And that for me was a moment where I thought what sort of undergirds all of this research is this idea that we do need to be engaged and participative. And I really want my students to know that.
So one of the things you had mentioned earlier was giving people the space for their voices to be heard. And I would imagine that in politics and in the political arena, there are many people and many groups that feel as if they can't be heard. How can other political communication scholars, like what questions should they be asking, and how can we sort of navigate that whole area of some people being heard too much and others not being heard at all? I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah, I don't know if I have an exact answer to that, but some things that I've learned from the research I've done on political opinion expression are really about what we can do, right? What you can do as a person to improve the climate, because let's face it, we can't do anything about other people, but we can do something about ourselves. And when I was asking people about the reasons they avoid expressing themselves, we're conflict avoidant, right? I mean, as humans, and particularly in our culture, and we're sort of taught to do that. So if you're entering into a political discussion with someone, coming at them as in competition or trying to convince them or change their mind or win is not the way to produce, a good political conversation. So I think going in with the goal of understanding but not winning is a really good approach for that. And unfortunately, this thing that I think is so important, right? These everyday political discussions, it's really unfortunate that we don't have any training in how to do that. So that's something that I think we need to acknowledge. There's a reason why people aren't good at this. It's because we never learned how.
Right. Yeah. I think that's really important to think about, and to just have that conversation. Do you ask your students, like, have y'all ever talked about engagement in politics or had a political conversation before?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, it's inevitably going to come up. I think, there's a different approach with the undergraduate students. In order for everyone in there to feel like they have sort of equal footing, I find it sort of necessary to make sure if I give an example of a poor speech by a Republican, I'm going to give an example of a poor speech from a Democrat. And so just making sure that people feel like they have a place to engage with the material regardless of their perspective. Now, in a graduate seminar, it's a little bit of a different story, because they're just the nature of what graduate classes are. They have a little bit more room to express themselves.
So I would imagine that social media has played a pretty significant role in political communication research. I'm not sure if it has in your research, but could you just talk about that? Because it just feels like so many of the conversations that we have about politics are had or held on social media. And one of the things that you mentioned was people don't always feel comfortable to voice their opinion, but social media may open that door They're not anonymous, but they're able to sort of be more vocal than they might be in person. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah.
And it can be anecdotal.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, social media has a huge role in the way we're understanding political communication right now, because it's not only a place for discussion and expression, but it's also the means by which a lot of people get news. And so it's super important. I would say a couple of things that we sort of know now about political communication and social media is, one, there was this concern, I'm sure you've everyone's heard about, like echo chambers, and your friends tend to be similar to you, and then you create these social networks that are similar to you. So the concern was that we get into our little enclaves that are just agreeable opinions. And for a while, some research was sort of supporting that we do build those agreeable social networks, but also research shows that it allows us to be exposed to more diverse opinions than we would otherwise. So social media definitely has the opportunity to give people that exposure to people who are different from them, and that's important. So it may be opinions, it may be news, but social media does present us with an opportunity to hear things that we don't necessarily agree with, which can be a good thing. As far as expression goes, yeah, it's a place where, of course, we had hoped, scholars hoped, like, oh, this is going to be great, this sort of platform where everyone's equal, and even better, we can have a comment section around news, and we'll have this wonderful, deliberative engagement, where people talk about, the important issues of the day. And we all know comment sections didn't exactly turn out to be that that ideal space. But it does still give people a space to express themselves, which is important.
So let's shift gears just slightly. Can you tell us a little bit about how the pandemic has affected your research?
Sure. Well, this is, I'm not someone who previously preferred to work from home. I'm very much an in the office person. So that has been a big shift for me, but I did finally find my flow for working at home. So that makes a little bit of a difference. Something, as I mentioned earlier, being collaborative and liking to work with other people, those conversations that you have in the office sometimes can really inform, at least for me, my research. And so I miss those. That has an effect. Fortunately, as far as research, I'm still able to, do studies because people are answering, my surveys or doing the experiments via the internet. So fortunately, that has not had a huge influence on whether or not I'm able to do research. And I guess finally, being at home and also having a second grader doing school from home, I wouldn't say it has improved my productivity so much, but I will say that my 7-year-old definitely knows more about what I study now.
Oh, that's cool.
Well, I think that's definitely a bright spot in it all. So finally, as academics, we do have the good fortune of being able to travel to different countries or different cities around the world in the United States for conferences. What's one of the favorite places you visited when you've traveled to present research, or a place that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, that is such a benefit. And it took me years to understand that I could actually leave the conference hotel and I should go out and see these places. I would have to say that ICA, the International Communication Association conference in Czech Republic back in 2018 was a real high spot. I loved being in Prague. I thought it was great. The people were great. It was so beautiful. So that really stands out. And in the future, hopefully, I think a few years from now, ICA is supposed to be in Hawaii, and I am looking forward to that.
Okay, that's definitely one to put on the calendar.
I'll say this. Kim and I went to a conference in Hawaii, APA, and it was the we were at poster sessions where nobody was there. And then we might have stepped
including
outside.
presenters.
Right, including presenters. And we might have stepped outside to a beach area, and then there were all of the academics.
Right.
I mean, put the posters on the beach then, right?
That's right.
Right, exactly. Cynthia, it's been so great to talk with you today, and we really appreciate you sharing with us a little bit more about the research that you do, and I'm sure our listeners are going to be thrilled to hear it. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Cynthia.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for joining us today in our conversation with Dr. Cynthia Peacock. We certainly covered a lot of territory related to politics and how it can sometimes affect our relationships. Next week, we're going to talk about another issue that's been on everyone's minds and on the media radar: misinformation specific to health. We have a great conversation with Dr. Ji-Young Lee coming up next week. Please tune in. This is a really great one. Have a great week. We look forward to seeing you next week.